Good morning, everyone. Hope you guys are all staying safe and healthy. This COVID-19 lockdown. Out here practicing social distancing. As you can see, there is no one around. But it's been a while, been a couple of months since I'd done another installment of the trick series. Today I'm actually going to talk about what I bring to the field real quick. I know I've talked it before, I'm going to talk it again. It's kind of what I bring out when I'm doing a run. But then I'm going to get into the meat and potatoes of doing tricks through gaps. One of my earlier videos, I think one of the first videos I did was tiny gaps. That's just kind of an instruction on how to like fly through tiny gaps, trees, obstacles, doesn't matter, any kind of gap that you can think of, how to progress and eventually go from a really large gap, kind of like an opening like this in this gazebo, all the way down to, say, something really small like an opening in the slide or something. Today I'm going to tell you, or walk through kind of my methodology of how I work up to doing tricks through bigger gaps like this, all the way through doing bigger tricks. And I'm sorry that I'm pointing like way out there in the middle of nothing, but doing tricks through smaller gaps like tiny openings and playground sets and stuff like that. And I'm also going to talk to you about what I consider the 3 types of tricks through gaps, or 3 points at which you would start your trick through the gap, and each of those brings its own level of difficulty. So I'm going to get right into my kit real fast. So what I did is I repurposed a fin bag. This is old school. I've had this thing for years. But I've repurposed it for props. It's pretty slick. It's got, I haven't sorted it yet just because I go through props so quickly. But I think each of these little compartments would be pretty slick. You could put the different directions of the prop in each little compartment. I just throw them all in the middle and just keep them stowed like this, because usually when I wreck, I torque all 4 props and I have to switch with all of them. The rest of the gear is pretty standard. I bring a bag of batteries with me, and then the rest of my gear. It's pretty straightforward, nothing crazy there. So let's get straight to it. I'm going to walk down here as I talk. So I'm just going to do some hand gesturing as I talk through these little gaps. The first is going to be how the levels of difficulty. So when to initiate a trick through a gap. Let's see if I can pick one of these. Just for the sake of simplicity. Actually, let's use this little handle thing here. So that's not a very good. Interesting. Yeah, let's use the handle thing. So the 3 types, or the 3 areas for initiating a trick through a gap. I would suggest they would be like pre-gap, in the gap, and then post-gap. So before the gap, in the gap, and after the gap. Those are kind of like your 3 areas of when you would initiate a trick. And the reason I say levels of complexity is because if you're depending on how far away you are from the gap when you initiate a trick, determines how hard it's going to be to get through the gap to either do another trick or to safely make it out to the other side. So in levels of complexity or difficulty, I would say that initiating a trick before the gap is probably the most difficult to start your trick. And the reason being is because when you do your trick, say a roll, which is probably one of the easier maneuvers because you never lose line of sight as the direction or path that you're flying. So let's say you initiate a roll. If you're going to do the initiation before the gap, you have to be able to recover your quad, identify the hole in the gap, and then safely fly through it. So this one to me is probably the most complex or most difficult, because here you're losing orientation momentarily as you're starting your trick, and then you have to recover and then fly through the actual gap that you're trying to stick or hit. So to me that would be like a 10 of 10 in complexities, depending on the trick you're trying to hit. If you're just flying through doing like a yaw, some sort of a flat and level yaw, like that's not very hard. But if you're in there doing like flips, rolls, or a combination of flips and rolls prior to coming in through the gap, that's pretty hard. The next would be a trick initiated in the gap. So when you're inside of a gap, and where this is hard, or where this brings a certain level of complexity, I'd say like a 7, is if you're in a situation where you have overhead. So you're flying through kind of like a gazebo or some low obstruction or obstacle, and you initiate your trick while you're inside of the gap. And to me, like I said, I rate this between a 5 and a 7 on complexity or difficulty. And the reason is because here you have to use a lot of throttle control. because if you're starting your trick high, your quad's going to fall out of the air quickly. If you're starting low, your quad is going to blip up to start the trick, so you may impact the ceiling of the obstacle that you're trying to do your trick through. So here is a lot of throttle control, because inside, and this is why I rate it probably a 7 or maybe even an 8, is because it requires a lot of throttle control. So a lot of my tricks, I'll start low, give it a little bit of a throttle blip, initiate the trick, and then drop down and recover and fly away while flying through the gap. The other one that's hard is when you're flying flat and level and you try and initiate a trick and then, you know, not hit the ground on the opposite side. So this one, like I said, between a 5 and a 7 on complexity. So pre, enter, and then exit gap. So if you're just learning and you're getting comfortable with doing gaps and tricks through gaps, the easiest way to build that confidence is to do it after you've flown through the gap. And I would say a large portion of the community, the majority of the gaps, because a lot of people don't like destroying their hardware. I don't really mind some. I mean, I do mind so much, but as you can see, my quads take quite the hit. But most people don't like to bang their gear up because it is expensive. So you got to save your money, save your parts, and make them last as long as you possibly can. But if you're getting into, you're interested in doing tricks through gaps, which I suggest getting into it, because man, it brings a level of fun that just far surpasses just flying around, you know, doing whatever it is that we do in the field. But if you're trying to get into tricks through gaps, what I recommend is the initiation of a trick either just post, like as you're leaving the gap, or just outside of the gap. And I would rate this a complexity level of probably 2 to 4, only because there's no risk here. The only risk is you falling and hitting the ground, like you losing altitude and hitting the ground, or are you doing some sort of maneuver that brings you back into the obstacle, like a power loop may bring you back into the obstacle that you may hit. So here, you're coming out. As soon as you exit the gap, you initiate your maneuver. And this one is really easy. So if you're working up to the levels of complexities of gaps, so say you're working up to pre-tricks or post or inside the gap, this is a perfect way to do it. So you fly through the gap and then you initiate your trick. And then what you do there is you build on that. You continue to slowly bring it back until you're finally getting comfortable with pulling off a trick before you enter the gap. You enter the gap, do another trick, and you exit the gap and do a third trick. And that's the ultimate goal, is to get through where you're just comfortable doing tricks at any portion throughout your flight. And it makes your videos look bomb-tastic. So coming in, you're flying in, you do a trick pre, you recover, you do a trick inside, and then you fly through and do a trick on the other side and continue to fly away. Some people have asked about rates. I do run really high rates, so I run about 80, 82. I think it's 82, 82, and 72. And the reason I run such high rates is because a lot of times when you're really low to the ground and you're trying to do a trick, you need your quad to rotate quickly so you don't impact the ground. And that's important when you're trying to do tricks through small gaps, like low gaps like this. So if I'm coming through the bottom, you know, and I'm flying through and I want to hit a gap here, a lot of times you have to rotate very quickly to even make the trick. Slow rotations are good. I love a slow rotated trick. I think they're awesome. They look real smooth, but typically I only do the slow rotation if I know that I have enough time and altitude to recover. So there with the rates, also running a really high rate allows me to control my rate of spin. So if I have to get on the gas and do a really fast trick to get into an area, a gap, having really high rates allows me to do that. Whereas if I had really slow rates, I may get to this point here and just dive the quad into the obstacle, and I don't really want to do that. So having really high rates, I can fly in really low and fast, hit the maneuver, and still recover altitude to fly out the other side safely and not strike the ground. And alternatively, having really high rates, there I just use throttle control, and I can actually limit. I can still do a slow rotation, but if I need to get on the throttle and rotate quickly, I can. I have the power and authority to do that because my rates are so high. So that's really why I run high rates. And the other reason is because doing a hard maneuver, here, let's walk back up to the gazebo. Doing a hard maneuver through, say, like a gazebo like this, so where you guys have seen, I do the hurricane flip. The last video I posted where I pulled the hurricane flip, I did it inside this gazebo. That's a really technical trick. And then trying to pull that off in this low, I mean, you guys can see this thing's only 8 feet. So, you know, 8 feet, and then the space is probably 15, 12 feet. So as I was flying through here, you know, I start low because of the gap I'm trying to enter. I start low, I fly in, I give it a little bit of a blip, initiate my trick, and then fly through to the other side and out. If I had low rates, I could probably pull that off, but I would require more altitude, and again, that brings more risk to hitting structures above your head or not completing the trick before you hit the ground. So you'd end up like that. But so now I did that long talk through. Let's actually throw a pack on and I'll fly through and re-demonstrate what I just talked about, but flying it versus talking it. So be right back. All right, welcome back. Video's a little herky-jerky here. Okay, this may take me a few battery packs, but let's get on. Let's try this out. So right into what I was talking about. So doing a pre-gap trick, an internal gap trick, and a post-gap trick. So I'm gonna explode, but we're gonna use this little opening here. But one thing I failed to mention as I was talking through this little opening here was choosing a trick that you know you can stick very well. So what I suggest is, obviously you want to work on your repertoire of tricks. So don't limit yourself to only rolls because that's what you're comfortable with. The goal is to start out doing tricks through gaps with the trick that you are most comfortable with, and then work that up to a trick that you're not comfortable with. Because what will happen is you'll start exploding early on, and then you'll get frustrated because you just broke it like that. You just break a lot of gear. So what I suggest is, if you're really comfortable with rolls, start with rolls. That's probably the easiest trick in the book to start practicing these maneuvers, tricks through gaps, is a roll. Next I would try a flip. Next I would try some other crazy maneuver that you have in your textbook. So choose an easy trick. Makes it a lot more fun because you don't wreck as often. And everybody likes not wrecking. So let's get back to it. So what I just talked about was pre. So this right here would be like a pre-gap area. So anytime you do a trick in this little section here would be pre. Doing a trick in here would be like doing the actual trick in the gap, and then obviously yep. So you guys get what I'm saying. Let's get to it here again. Reset, boom. All right, so most complex right here, you're gonna do the trick before you enter the gap, and you guys see it takes a little bit to perfect that, because as you're coming in, you lose visibility on the trick. Now you can change that by doing like a backflip, because you never really lose sight of the ground or the obstacle that you're flying through. So a backflip, I would say, would be the easiest maneuver, because again, you actually come back into the ground, comes back into your visual perspective a lot sooner than, like, say, a front flip, where you completely lose all orientation for a split second. So that would be a more complex trick. A roll in this area is what I would say start out with. So just like I did there pre-gap, you're gonna come into the area that you wanna do the trick, like here. You're gonna fly in, execute the maneuver, and then get back on orientation quickly. As you can see, it's hard to do, and even when I'm trying to talk through this in simplest forms on a very easy gap, you guys see I've banged into that pole a couple of times. Next in complexity would be doing a trick in the gap, so here. That brings the stress level way, 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 way down, and this is why I gave it a 5 to 7, because it is really easy to do a trick. I say really easy, let me back that up. It's easier to do a trick right here than it is to do it before the gap. Then next simplest would be after the gap. So you fly through the gap, like here, and you bust your maneuver and then continue to fly around. So those would be what I would say are the three ways to bust gaps. So pre, you're doing it here. Most complex because you got to line back up with the gap. I'm about to lose this pack. I'm gonna have to change. And then in the gap, so here, pretty easy because you never lose visual orientation totally. And then post would be just on the opposite side. You bust out and you continue to fly. Those would be the 3 areas, and that's what I would say work up to. And find a big gap. So let me put this on pause for a second, and we'll come back. 1 second. He back. Here we go. So back to where I left off. Tricks before, after. Another way that you can simplify this is choosing a gap that's safe. So get a bigger gap. Like this gap here may be really small. Like back to the tiny gaps instructional video. This may be a tiny gap for somebody. So don't limit yourself, or don't like stress yourself out and say, oh my gosh, this down here, this is a tiny gap. Well, for some that is a tiny gap. For others, this is a tiny gap. And for others flying out in wide open spaces, this is a tiny gap. So go with what you're most comfortable with. Come out here in the open, practice your maneuver, whatever the maneuver is that you want to pull off in a gap. Come out here, do it 1,000 times. When you're absolutely comfortable with hitting that trick, come down here and say, okay, this is what I'm most comfortable with. I'm gonna practice the gap in here, or the trick in the gap here. Now, I talked early on in the other video about throttle control. Throttle control is key. Depending on the complexity of the trick, it will drive where you start your entry into the gap. And this is very important, folks. Listen to me when I say this. Throttle control and quad position is absolutely paramount when coming in to do tricks in the gap. Reason being is because depending on the complexity of the trick, just like that, you need to have enough altitude to complete the rotation of the trick before you exit the gap. So if you start here, and this is where you want to start your trick, notice the altitude I just lost versus I want a little bit of a float. I'm going to come in low, give it a little bit of a throttle blip, and it makes it much more smooth. So I start low, coming in low, I know it's going to be a hard trick, give it a little bit of a throttle blip, gives me plenty of time to exit the obstacle. And again, like I said, the reason that's important is because the complexity of the trick you want to hit, you come in low, it gives me enough time to spin through that obstacle and exit safely on the other side. Versus as I come in like this, I'm just going to wreck because I know it. Oh, you see the difference? I started high and it didn't give me enough altitude to clear the other side. So I might not even be able to fly. Oh, yep. So again, where you enter the gap is absolutely critical. So if your trick is complex, start low to give yourself a throttle blip and time to rotate through the gap. If you're just hauling through really fast and you want to pull it off, you can start high. You're just ripping through. I just want to get through the gap. And something else too, that throttle control piece, something I practice a lot. This is something I put a lot of time into, is learning drop rate. And this is something I've never heard another pilot talk about, drop rate. We always talk about throttle control and roll and yaw and rate. Drop rate. Drop rate is the rate in which your quad, how fast your quad falls based on its weight. So the overall, we talk about weight. Why is weight important? Well, battery endurance is one reason, but I like to think of quad weight as drop rate. And the reason is because as you start progressing through tricks and gaps, you need to know how quickly your quad drops so that you can learn and know and understand, can I even pull a trick off through this gap? And that's typically why if I come out to an area and I know I want to pull a particular trick, I'll fly through that gap a few times and just give some throttle blips to see what it takes to get through. And once I've made it through, then I'll know like, oh, okay, cool. I have enough time to fly through here, give it a little bit of a throttle blip, woo, and pull off the maneuver, just like that. So again, drop rate. How do you practice drop rate? Line of sight. Fly line of sight, a lot of line of sight, and something else you can do is come up to an obstacle, and I think I've talked about it in other videos, but just float over something. So come through, I'm gonna come over this, I give it throttle, and then I float over top of it. So I come on the throttle, full throttle blip, off the throttle, coast it down. How much drop? How long did it take to drop? Where did my quad end up when I finished the drop? And again, that's important because as you start to do maneuvers over top of things, you want to know if you have enough altitude to clear the obstacle on the opposite side as you do a trick like that over top of an obstacle. Because that's another trick through a gap, or a trick on a gap, is going over something. So you're going to come over top and then come back in, do the trick through the gap. So throttle control and knowing your altitude, rate of descent, is very, very important. I can't stress it enough. Rate of descent, rate of descent, rate of descent. Know that feeling, because that will also help you drive through like sticking gaps like that. But you guys get the gist. I think that's it. So a quick recap, rehash, pre-trick, pre-gap trick, most complex. You're coming towards the gap, you're coming here, you do the trick before you go in the gap. That is the hardest trick through a gap, absolutely, hands down, because you're losing you're losing orientation and visual line of sight of the obstacle before you do the trick. Trick in the gap, pretty low, a little bit lower on the complexity scale and heart rate. Your heart rate will be a little bit lower when you pull that. And then the last would be you fly through the gap and then you bust the maneuver. Almost hit that bench, but you guys get it, and you'll get out there and you'll have fun with this, and you'll tear up some props, but find a big obstacle to try it on, to practice on. That's it. I hope you guys enjoy this video. Thanks for hanging out. Any other videos you guys would like to see, you want to see me talk through another trick or whatever, drop it in the comments and we'll try and get it done. So thanks for watching. Again, appreciate your guys' support. Stay healthy and safe out there. Until next time, peace.